In the spring of 1982, every farmer in Stafford County, Kansas, planted straight rows across their fields without question or hesitation, because straight rows were not a preference but a principle, as settled and unexamined as the flatness of the land itself. Corn, wheat, and soybeans all followed the same disciplined grid that had been laid down by the first generation of men to farm this county and maintained by every generation since, the pattern repeating itself each spring with the comfortable regularity of something that has never been seriously challenged. The county agronomist would drive the roads in April and nod approvingly at the rectangular plots stretching to the horizon, confirming what everyone already believed, that the land grew best this way, that the straight line was the right line, and that deviation from it was the kind of thing that wasted good seed and embarrassed good families. On a cool Tuesday morning in April, 58-year-old Henry Calloway stood at the edge of his 120 acres and looked at the gentle slope that ran down toward Mulberry Creek with the particular attention of a man who has been studying the same piece of ground for a long time and is still finding things in it worth studying. Henry had farmed this land since he was 20, inheriting it from a father who believed in straight lines the way other men believed in Scripture, completely, without reservation, and with a mild suspicion of anyone who suggested there might be another way. Henry had farmed those straight lines for years after his father's death, following the same grid, respecting the same tradition. But 15 years of watching water move across this particular slope had taught him something that the straight lines were not accounting for, and he had spent those 15 years doing something about it quietly, in the corner of the property behind the old barn where the neighbors couldn't easily see, while the rest of the county went on plowing its perfect rectangular rows and nodding at each other across fence lines in the shared satisfaction of people doing things the way they have always been done. Henry's father had given him the beginning of the idea without meaning to, and a warning delivered years before Henry fully understood what it meant. Water follows the path of least resistance, his father had said. Fight it straight and it'll wash you away. His father had meant it as a caution about stubbornness, about men who refused to bend, but Henry had heard it differently, as a description of the land itself, as an observation about what water actually did when it hit a plowed field on a slope and found nothing to slow it down. He had watched it happen in his father's lifetime, watched 6-inch rainstorms carry 2 inches of topsoil off conventional fields and deposit it in drainage ditches and creek beds, watched the land get thinner and harder every decade while the farmers who worked it kept plowing the same straight furrows and wondering why yields were drifting slowly downward. He had started small, digging the first contour terraces on a 3-acre plot behind the barn in the late 1960s, working by hand and by observation, building shallow channels that followed the natural curve of the hill rather than running perpendicular to it. 18 inches deep, spaced 12 feet apart, with a gentle slope that moved water sideways across the hill instead of letting it accelerate straight down toward the creek. He measured everything. Soil density at 1.32 grams per cubic centimeter. pH maintained at 6.5. He calculated that each terrace could hold an additional 1,250 gallons of water per acre during heavy rainfall, slowing the runoff and giving the soil time to absorb what the sky was delivering instead of watching it race downhill and disappear. He planted cover crops along each terrace level, crimson clover and winter rye, to hold the soil between the rows and give the terraces something living to work with through the wet seasons. He kept detailed journals from 1969 onward, logging rainfall totals, runoff measurements, and soil depth readings with the patient consistency of a man who understands that a single season proves nothing but that 15 seasons prove something you can stand behind. By 1981, his records showed clearly what the 3-acre plot behind the barn had been demonstrating all along, that a 6-inch rainstorm on a conventional straight-plowed field could strip 2 inches of topsoil in a single event, and that his terraced ground held through those same storms without losing an inch. He knew what his journals said. He had simply been waiting for the opportunity to demonstrate it at scale. The spring of 1982 was the year he extended the terraces across his full 120 acres, and the county noticed. The Hoffman brothers were working their adjacent fields when Henry's Ford 7610 appeared on the freshly cut terraces, moving along the contour lines instead of the familiar straight rows, and they stopped what they were doing to watch with the expression of men observing something they cannot immediately categorize. Roy Callum, who managed the co-op and whose clipboard represented the official consensus of how Stafford County farmed, leaned against his grain truck and delivered his verdict loudly enough to carry across the field. Terraces? On a hill? You might as well be planting in your living room. The Hoffman brothers found this sufficient and added their own contributions, something about bringing a shovel for the tractor when the rain came. And the laughter that followed was the kind that gathers momentum from the presence of an audience, bending men at the waist, shaking loose and loud across the flat spring air. Neighbors gathered at the fence line and whispered about crazy Calloway, about wasted fields and wasted seed, about what Henry's father would have thought if he could see what his son was doing to good farmland. Henry checked the slope on his tractor, adjusted a wheel, and kept planting. The terraces were dug to his measurements. The cover crops were in. The journals were full of 15 years of data that nobody standing at that fence line had asked to see, and he was not going to offer it to them now. He would offer it to them in September, in the form of a yield. The rain came on May 14th, and it did not come gently. A storm system stalled over Stafford County and delivered 12.6 inches of rain over 3 days, the kind of sustained soaking that tests everything a field has been built to handle and quickly reveals what it has not. The straight-plowed fields, which had no mechanism to slow the water moving across their surfaces, became rivers of mud within hours of the storm's beginning. The Hoffman brothers watched 4 inches of topsoil leave their 90-acre wheat field in the runoff, the dark earth moving in sheets toward the drainage ditches, seeds floating in the brown water that poured off the furrows in steady streams. Roy Callum's soybean field, plowed to his exacting standard in perfect straight lines, had water pooling in every furrow, standing long enough to kill 30% of the young plants before it finally drained away. Farmers walked their fields on the second and third days of the storm with the particular stillness of people absorbing damage they cannot stop and cannot yet fully measure, watching the land they had trusted for decades behave like an enemy. Henry walked his terraces on the same days and saw something different. Water was pooling in the channels exactly as he had calculated it would, sitting briefly against the terrace walls and then seeping downward into the soil at the rate the ground could absorb it rather than the rate gravity would otherwise dictate. The cover crops held the soil between the rows. The topsoil stayed where it had been the day before the storm and the day before that. His 120 acres absorbed more than 10,500 gallons of water per acre over the 3 days without losing a measurable inch of surface soil. The terraces doing precisely what 15 years of journals said they would do, quietly and without drama, in the middle of the worst rainstorm Stafford County had seen in a generation. By the 4th morning, when the storm had passed and the sun returned and farmers walked out to assess what remained of their spring planting, the difference between Henry's fields and the fields around them was not a matter of interpretation or degree. It was visible from the road. His terraces were green and intact. The neighboring fields looked like the aftermath of something that had gone badly wrong. The harvest in September produced numbers that the county could not argue with regardless of how it felt about terraces. Henry's wheat yielded 84 bushels per acre across his terraced fields. His neighbors averaged 42 to 50 bushels per acre on ground that had lost 4 inches of topsoil and a significant portion of its young plants in the May storm. Net profit on Henry's 120 acres came to $28,560. Net profit on comparable straight-plowed acreage came to $10,750. The difference was not close enough to be explained by weather variation or seed quality or any of the other variables that farmers reach for when they need an alternative to the obvious conclusion. The terraces had worked. The journals had been right. The 15 years of careful observation behind the old barn had produced exactly the result they pointed toward, and the result was sitting in Henry's grain bins and in the co-op's records for anyone who wanted to look at them. Roy Callum came to Henry with a sheepish look that carried the full weight of how loudly he had leaned against that grain truck in April and how clearly everyone remembered it. He said he hadn't believed in terraces and that he had been wrong, and could Henry help him build some for next season. Henry said yes. The Hoffman brothers arrived separately with their tractor and asked for Henry's notes, the exact measurements, the spacing, the cover crop mix, the terrace depth, all of it, and Henry gave them the information without ceremony and without the pause that the moment might have entitled him to. He had not spent 15 years on this for the satisfaction of being right in front of people. He had spent 15 years on it for the wheat, and the wheat had made its point more effectively than he ever could have. By the following spring, terraces were no longer the subject of fence line whispers in Stafford County. They were being built on farm after farm, the men who had laughed the loudest now measuring contour lines and ordering crimson clover seed. The conversion happening with the quiet speed of a community that has decided to move past something and prefers not to dwell on the details of where it started. Roy Callum began hosting workshops on soil conservation, which was a remarkable thing for a man whose clipboard had once represented the official position that straight rows were the only rows worth plowing. The Hoffman brothers offered Henry a partnership in an erosion control consulting arrangement, bringing his methods to farmers in neighboring counties who had heard about the May storm and its uneven results and wanted to understand the difference before the next one arrived. Henry Calloway retired at 78, having watched the county's relationship with its own land change in ways that his journals from 1969 had quietly predicted. His grandchildren ran the farm and still followed the same contour lines he had drawn 40 years earlier. The terraces now repaired and expanded and taken entirely for granted in the way that good ideas are eventually taken for granted once enough time has passed for people to forget that anyone ever laughed at them. Sometimes the quietest farmer at the fence line is the one who has been paying the closest attention. Sometimes 15 years of journals in a barn behind a 3-acre test plot is worth more than every clipboard in the county. And sometimes the lines that look like nothing more than ditches in the dirt are the only thing standing between a farm and a flood, holding the soil, holding the water, holding the whole season together while everything around them washes away.